Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Leona Agaritas, and I am the Executive Director of the Golden Triangle Business Improvement District. Our mission is to support the economic vitality of Washington, D.C.'s Central Business District. We've been hearing a lot lately about coronavirus, and most of us have been significantly changing some of the most fundamental things that we do every day. But how does coronavirus affect or potentially affect a business community? What are employer responsibilities? How do businesses continue their essential functions during a pandemic? We're going to explore these and more questions with you today. Although we've conducted several preparedness exercises over the last 10 years, this is our first webinar. We put this together quickly, very quickly, and we're still learning. That said, we hope that you find today's exercise just as useful as our in-person events. Later today, we will post follow-up resources on our website, and in a few days, we're going to provide a complete recording of today's event. So let's get started. On your screen, you will see several questions. Please answer and submit them. Okay, so let's look at our results a little bit here. It looks like about a third of you are in property management. You're the people who take care of the many big buildings that we all work in every day. About a third of you are managers or supervisors. We have some executive leadership at 13% and a lot of people in the other category. About 3 out of 4 of you have a high or very high level of anxiety about coronavirus, and about 1 out of every 4 have a low or very low level of anxiety. And then finally, our final question, do you think the workplace is prepared for coronavirus? 3 out of 4 of you feel that your workplace is very prepared, very well prepared. So that's great news. About 1 out of every 5 or 6 feel that your workplace is poorly prepared. So with that background, let's turn to our first guest, Kara Ariel, who is a partner at Holland and Knight Law Firm here in the Golden Triangle. Kara, would you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. Thanks, Leona. I'm really happy to be here this morning. I've been practicing management side employment law for about 20 years, counseling exclusively employers and HR folks on various issues that come up. In the last couple weeks, I would say the majority of my counseling practice has been focused on this issue, and I think it's an important issue, and I look forward to hopefully answering everyone's questions.
Okay, so let's get started. Kara, employers are obligated to provide a safe workplace for their employees, right? We try to do that every day. It's different during coronavirus, right? How is that different? What does that look like now?
Sure. So I think that really there are a few different guiding principles in terms of workplace safety in light of the coronavirus outbreak. I think first we need to think about the steps we're taking to reduce close contact and exposure in the workplace in terms of how we ensure that our facilities are cleaned. Do we have opportunities for employees to use hand sanitizer, wipes, disinfectant, these kinds of things? What steps are we taking to minimize close contact in terms of meetings, in terms of workspaces? Employers should be thinking about, to the extent practical, whether or not in-person meetings can be transitioned to phone meetings or altogether postponed. Thinking about if you have employees working in close proximity every day, is there a way to physically distance their workstations? And then the second piece, I think, of workplace safety is making sure that you're taking reasonable steps and communicating with your employees about any potential exposure to the virus from other employees who may have had potential exposure or exposure, in making sure employees are informed in a way that doesn't invoke panic, but that allows people to kind of identify when they may be more at risk for exposure.
So let's probe on that a little
Sure.
bit. You know, about a week ago, this question would have been a theoretical, but today it's a reality, and as time goes on, it could be even more of a reality. How do you manage that or balance an employee's privacy with the need to communicate to other people? Are you, first and foremost, as an employer, permitted? Is it reasonable to ask about travel history, or even more so now, whether you have been exposed to the virus? And then if an employee has been exposed to a virus, how do you balance their privacy with a need to make the others aware so that they can take whatever precautions they need to take?
Sure, yeah. So it's absolutely appropriate, and I would say advisable, to let employees know that if they believe they've had exposure, either because of close contact with someone who has been diagnosed or because they've had travel to an impacted region, although frankly I think that's becoming much less of an issue at this point. But certainly an employer can instruct employees to give them a heads up on that type of exposure and those types of issues. And then make decisions based on the information available, reasonable business decisions about the level of risk. I think that in terms of communicating to other employees about potential exposure, privacy remains a key critical legal compliance component. You cannot, you should not be identifying employees by name in communicating in the workplace about potential exposure. It is certainly appropriate, let's say you have an employee who's in the workplace, the next day they contact you, say they've had some exposure, it's absolutely appropriate to require them to stay home for 14 days. Now you may also require a return to work kind of notice or certificate from the doctor, but I want to make an important point about this. The CDC is saying, while we would usually do that, while we would usually have an employee provide a work return certificate, in these times and under these circumstances, it's not necessarily reasonable, right? Workplaces, I mean, medical offices are already overwhelmed, and so that may not be the best course of action. And that's one of many points, Leona, that I think is what we would call an exception to how we usually do things that is very specific to this issue.
Okay. All right. So then in the event that an employee does somehow have the virus, either they're testing positive or they have full-blown symptoms and they're not at work, in that case there is a best practice and even arguably a requirement to let others in the office know, and in that case you need to maintain the privacy of the person, so it's a general memo or email or something that says, you know, we just want to notify you that there has been a documented case in the office, and advise people to go to the CDC website and get guidance, or to check with their doctor. What is the second sentence of that email or memo?
Sure. I'm actually recommending a two-prong approach.
Okay.
The first piece is exactly what you described, right? Sort of a general notice to employees that there has been some exposure. Depending on your workplace, it may make sense to provide information about the extent of it. So for example, if you have multiple suites or multiple floors, to provide some information, you know, the employee used common areas and interacted closely with others on the fourth floor, right? So that type of information. In a small workplace, the reality is that your employees may piece together exactly who you're talking about, and there's not much we can do to prevent that, but you still need to make sure that as the employer, you're not confirming that identity and you know, violating that privacy. The second piece, and this is, I think, anytime you have an employee who you feel you have sufficient reason to send home, and this is, you know, especially if they've been diagnosed, is to make sure you get from that employee their best recollection of who they've been in contact with in the workplace in the past, ideally 2 weeks. So sit down, you know, who did you have face-to-face meetings with? Who do you sit next to? You know, get as much information as you can, because for those employees, you may want to send a more targeted response. I recommend, if you can, this is something you deliver in person because it's going to cause a lot more panic.
Right.
But trying to sit down with these employees and saying, you know, we have someone in the office who's been diagnosed, and we have information that you have been in close contact with this person in the past week or two. And a very likely piece of that is also, as a result, we'd like you to self-isolate for 2 weeks, and we're going to send you home also.
Wow. Okay, this is all some very useful information. Let's go to a couple more questions. Please turn to your screen and you'll see some questions come up. All right, so this is what you have told us about, well, most of you agree or strongly agree that your workplace has communicated well about coronavirus. That's great news. Most of you have modified your HR policies in response to coronavirus. That's 63% of the respondents have indicated that they've modified HR policies. And about half of you had telework policies and agreements in place before coronavirus, and the other half of you did not. And I'm assuming there's a rush to policy in those cases, given where we are. So let's follow these questions a little bit more with Kara. So, Kara, the CDC does suggest that for this pandemic in particular, that employers have a flexible leave policy in place for coronavirus, right? And so there are several questions about leave policies that I'd like to kind of probe with you a little bit. You touched on this one a minute or so ago. What if an employee is not feeling well, they're sick, but they insist on coming to work? What are employers' rights, responsibilities? What are the employees' rights and responsibilities?
Yep, you have an absolute right to send employees home in this situation.
Okay.
And that's both in terms of whether an employee is demonstrating signs of illness, or if you're aware that an employee has been exposed, even if they're not demonstrating signs of illness. The key piece here from a legal compliance standpoint is making sure you comply with wage and hour laws and paid sick leave laws. Those are the two pieces. So just to boil it down very quickly, non-exempt employees, hourly employees, only need to be paid for hours worked. They do not need to be paid for time that they do not work. Exempt employees, on the other hand, salaried employees, if the employee maintains that they are able and available to work, and as an employer, you take the position that they cannot work, there's some very specific rules in place. One of those rules is that if they perform any work in a single work week, including checking their email for 15 minutes, you are obligated to pay them for the entire week. So if you're going to place an employee on leave, and telework's not an option, I know we're going to talk about that, it's important that you take steps to ensure that your employee can't work if you're not going to be able to continue paying them. Another important piece is that if an exempt employee performs any work in a single work day and then takes part of the day off, whether they choose to do so or whether you require it, you need to pay them for the full day. So that's not to say you can't ask employees to use PTO or leave in those situations, but the payment obligation is there. So that, I think, is really important to understand.
Okay. All right. Half of the respondents did not have telework policy before, and I'm sure they're putting them in place as we speak, or may have already done so. Can you talk about what are the key elements of a good teleworking policy?
Sure. And I actually just yesterday prepared a guidance document on this. I'd be happy to have you share with the audience
great.
if there's
That's
a way
one.
to do that.
We'll load that on our resources after
So a temporary, what I recommend is that even if you have an existing telework policy, that you consider modifying it for this specific situation, because there's a lot of aspects of ongoing telework arrangements that may not necessarily apply here. The key things that you want to have in a temporary telework policy include that, number one, the employer retains discretion over this arrangement, the terms of the arrangement, the length of the arrangement, and that it can be modified or terminated immediately on written notice. You just want to have that as an expectation. The other thing I think you want to build in specifically in this situation are assurances that decisions, modifications will be considered on a case-by-case basis. So, communication is key in terms of company leadership, management, staying in close contact with the employee to identify exactly what kind of restrictions may be in place from the employee's perspective, what types of work can't be performed from home is important. Another key piece of the telework policy would be to say that your policies, your agreements, your expectations remain in effect unless otherwise indicated, including steps to protect employer confidentiality and employer property, and make sure that the security of your workplace and your customers' business interests are protected in this situation.
All right, but as you know, and I'm sure many of our listeners know that not everybody can telework, right? And what happens in that case? How does an employer deal with that situation? I mean, this is an extraordinary situation that we're in from the employee's perspective and from the employer's perspective.
Yeah, so first of all, leave is an option. And I think that to the extent an employer can be flexible with their paid leave policies and do things to kind of help support employees, at least to kind of bridge the gap between whatever the government is going to do. We do expect the federal government will be implementing some kind of emergency legislation or action to address this issue of employees that are hourly workers who can't telework. In terms of employees who may be essential, or even if it's just that you want to try to provide employees some opportunity to continue earning income, a few ideas include perhaps if you can bring some of these employees in on a rotating schedule into the office. This minimizes close contact and workplace exposure, and it won't be something you could do on a full-time basis, but if you have a number of employees who have overlapping job duties, you may be able to have a rotating schedule where voluntarily they can choose to come in maybe 2 out of 5 days a week and at least have some income continuation. There may also be steps that you can take, just steps you would want to take anyway, even if your workplace was open, in terms of distancing employees and making space for people to work, that may make it more viable and more comfortable for employees to continue coming to work. The reality is there's no perfect solution here, and we really just haven't dealt with anything like this on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. And you mentioned essential employees, and so and it's a little bit different from teleworking or not teleworking, right? Essential employees, and here in Washington, we have essential and non-essential, and we talk about that all the time. But usually we talk about it when there's a lot of snow outside, right?
Yeah.
And this is clearly not a snowstorm. And in a snow event, and I've been involved in many of them, they generally max out at 5 days, right? Our most onerous blizzards are a 5-day thing. This is probably not going to be just a 5-day thing. And there are a number of other concerns. I mean, when you're working in the snow, it's a question of safety, of getting to work safely or not. But here, there are bigger questions. How do you acknowledge, the essential employees are really kind of, climbing a little bit of a hill here. How do you as an employer acknowledge their concerns and their fears? And, I think positively, show some appreciation because these are the people who have to come in when the colleagues are not coming in. These are the people that may be cleaning up, doing that deep cleaning in that building. They may be picking up the trash. They may be doing things that are essential to the well-being of everybody.
I think this is a really important question. Of course, we want to be flexible and creative about whether we have telework options for employees that don't usually telework. But as you just pointed out, the reality is there are employees that cannot perform any of their duties remotely. Their job relies on being at work. I think that communication is critical, both in terms of letting employees know the steps you're taking to try to make the workplace as safe as possible, to try to keep them informed of any new developments. And I think that, appreciation efforts and recognitions can go a long way. Sending out communications to all employees, kind of highlighting the contributions of those who are here. To the extent either now or later on down the line, you have an opportunity to provide, benefits or bonuses or things like that. And I recognize that's not an easy answer for everybody, but I think that there's going to be a lot of different things we can do to recognize people that are working hard. The one point I want to make about this issue is that if you end up in a situation where you have an employee who is saying, I understand I need to be here, I will not come to work.
Right.
It's really critical that you don't take any adverse action without checking in with counsel.
Right.
You know, you may feel like, okay, I have no choice but to terminate this person, but we want to really manage that situation carefully. And part of the reason is because I think we're going to see employee rights kind of evolving in this process in terms of what our government says employees are allowed to do or not do in relation to their work. And so we want to keep an eye on that and make sure we're not reacting and running afoul of anything, or at a minimum creating a public relations or an employee relations problem.
Yeah. Wow. A lot of useful information.
Thanks.
Kara Ariel from Holland and Knight
you.
Law Firm. Thank you so much for your knowledge and your wisdom and your insights. Thank you for your flexibility. We have scheduled this and rescheduled it a couple of times,
Yeah.
and we really appreciate that. And thank you for offering the telework policy that we will post later today on our site. Great, great. Let's turn to some more questions.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Pat Powell. I'm the Senior Director of Operations and Emergency Preparedness here at the BID. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We are going to get into a really good discussion. It's great to follow the HR legal discussion that Leona and Kara had. We're going to talk a little bit more about business continuity at this point. We've got our results up, and let's take a look at what we've found. So it looks like a majority of you have a business continuity plan. It does look like a lot of that did not include the response to pandemic. So I'm sure that 71% number is going down by the day. That's again a great thing to include in your response plan and in your business continuity plan. Can you identify your organization's essential functions? 94% of you say that you can. That's great. That's a great first step to continuity, and we'll get a little bit more into that with our next guest. And do you feel confident that your workplace can continue functions? So that's a little bit mixed, but a majority of you, almost 2/3, seem to either agree or strongly agree that you can do that, and that's great. It means you've built those resilient systems and you've built that ability to take care of that. So without further ado, let me introduce our next guest. Dawn, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your current role at CNA?
Sure. So for my background, I went undergrad at Carnegie Mellon. Then I interned in DC when Oklahoma City bombing happened, got interested in terrorism, went to Hebrew U and studied counterterrorism, and then landed back in DC working at CNA, and that was 16 years ago. My role at CNA is I'm the co-director for the Center for Emergency Management Operations.
Great. Thank you, Dawn. And Dawn's joining us virtually, so this is one of our first times testing this. So far, it seems to be working. So, Dawn, do you want to take us through just a little bit of the basics, kind of a business continuity 101, before we get a little deeper into the topic?
Sure. So a little bit of, I'll give you a history first, a very brief one, don't worry. So, when continuity started, so 16 years at CNA, when I first started continuity, we talked about continuity as if your facility was the thing that was in jeopardy. Then there was a uptick in flu, and we talked a little bit about kind of what a pandemic looks like, but it was still pretty localized. So it was really about absenteeism. Then Katrina, and we talked more regionally. So what happens when your plans need to take into account other people's plans as well, so that you're not all using the same resources. And then we hit cyber, which was our supposed topic for today, but got preempted, but it's still around. And cyber continuity looks different. There's some added kind of challenges to it. And now, of course, that brings us to today when we're looking at something that's global. And this global business continuity picture is more challenging. We start to have to talk about supply chain. We have to start talking about demand and about absenteeism, but for a very long extended period of time. So that's kind of how we got there. You know, your poll identified kind of the crux of what continuity is. It's identifying those mission essential functions. It doesn't stop there though. Once you identify them, you need to kind of look at the people that you need to do them, the facilities, the equipment, the supplies, the data, and the systems that you need to run them. So it's making sure that you have all those things in place to actually be able to do those mission essential functions.
That sounds great. Let me take a moment. I'm going to frame our discussion up a little bit. As many of you may know, as Leona mentioned, we've been doing exercises for 10 years, and you know, we had a great exercise planned up for this one related to cyber, and everything changed. The whole world changed. So in the kind of still in the same thought process of an exercise, today we're going to kind of talk through two what I call situations. So the first situation, or the first part of this, is essentially today. It's a pandemic that's spreading. It's an incident that's emerging. It's essentially conditions as they are today. The second situation, or the second type of thing we're going to talk about, we're going to transition to what this looks like in a more widespread pandemic, in a regional perspective or national perspective. And each of these two situations will have a progressively larger impact on business continuity. So let's go ahead and get started with kind of the threat emerging as it is today. So Dawn, what types of decision-making structures and processes should organizations have in place, hopefully in place today?
So hopefully you have a COOP manager, so somebody who kind of does continuity. I would say that for this, you might need different subject matter experts kind of in that small circle of people making decisions. So somebody who can read and interpret and understand kind of the CDC guidance and other guidance that's coming out is an important person to have as part of that inner COOP circle. I think you also need to understand what decisions you're going to be needing to make, and then maybe set some clear trigger points for them. Those trigger points are tricky. They're different for everybody based on your kind of risk assessment and the essentialness of your mission essential functions. But laying them out really will help you when push comes to shove and you're really going to need to make a decision. So for those trigger points, I would say identify those sources of information that you're going to use, so that whether that's a certain number of cases in your area or a certain number of your workforce becoming ill, that you've clearly defined what those trigger points are using good sources.
No, that's great. And to kind of piggyback on the sources of information, we are going to, as Leona noted, we're going to gather some links together of some reliable sources of information. We're going to put that on our website along with the items that you'll hear us talk about today, like Kara's telework policy. We'll have that available on our website, and then we'll kind of keep growing that. A lot of these resources are the ones you'll hear talked about frequently with the CDC and the World Health Organization and your other local health departments. So how should companies, Dawn, go about identifying and determining what their mission essential functions? It looks like a large majority of our group has already done so. If for those who haven't, how do they go about doing that?
It's the few things that make you a business. So if you didn't do these things, you wouldn't have a business anymore, or you wouldn't be performing the very role that you're intended to perform. It can come down to 2 or 3 things. It can come down to more than that. But it's really those things that let you bring services and or products to the rest of the world.
In getting a little deeper in that, what should companies look to ensure they have resiliency in the ability to do those mission essential functions? How do they make sure they have what are the types of things they should look at within that to make sure that they're able to perform that? Kind of as one example, the Golden Triangle bid relies on contractors for several of our essential services, and this past several weeks, we have really been working with our contractors to make sure that they have plans in place and that they have the ability to complete their mission essential functions, because they really contribute to our mission essential functions.
That's a great point, Pat, and you should absolutely be looking at that. So for each of your mission essential functions, because these things might be different for each of them, who does them, kind of what those people need to be able to do that. So some cases it's equipment, it's just a laptop, and in some cases it's much bigger things that need maintenance, okay? So, but they need them to continue their mission essential functions. What supplies? So those consumables that you are going to use as you do your functions, but at some point, if the supply chain doesn't keep going, they run out. And then finally, those people you rely on, exactly as you were saying, Pat, those people that you need them to help you. One point is transportation. So if you're a company that makes widgets, you don't use those widgets, you send them out for other people to use. And so is the transportation going to be there for you to then send out your widgets to other people? So yeah, but that's for each mission essential function, because as I said, it's going to be different for each of those.
Don, when we talked, that's a very good point. When we talked about the mission essential functions, I think a lot of folks, as we saw in the survey, have identified their mission essential functions. But planning is also a component of the continuity process. And what part of planning should folks be doing right now? They've identified their functions. Now they're ready to take the next step.
I would say you need a response structure. So if somebody was in charge of COOP, they might need some help. So they should probably surround themselves with a few people, somebody who does know your IT system very well, somebody who can, provide that interpretation of CDC and WHO results. There should be a team of folks now that are dealing with this continuity, because issues are going to continue to arise, and it's really going to be more than one person can do. I think also a strategy document. So you have a COOP plan, a lot of you do, and that's fantastic. It's always good to kind of do that crisis action planning as well, so that you take your pre-plans and you look at them in light of the current situation. And you don't have to write a whole new plan, but kind of some key strategy steps for how you're going to get through the next 6 weeks, or some bite-sized piece of time, and then start to highlight your overarching strategy.
Don, how can folks develop redundancies and kind of resiliency within their mission essential functions, either with their staff or their systems? How can they go ahead and do a little of that right now?
Sure. So when you look at your mission essential functions and you look at kind of who does them, you have some non-essential employees that could be cross-trained to do those as well. And it's a great time to do it right now before there's kind of widespread contagion within this area. So making sure that you have a bench of people who can do each of your mission essential functions. Your IT folks, just keep asking them about their redundancies and making sure that the systems have been tested to have many more people than is normally VPNing in at one time, That might include a test of your system to see how it goes and to see what the bandwidth is.
Those are great tips for folks, Don. As part of the RSVP process, we did receive several questions, and I'd like to kind of talk through a couple of them that I can answer, that we can kind of answer, and a few that we can't, because as we talked about, as Leona talked about at the beginning, this is an ever-changing incident that, even since we wrote some of the questions and the script for this just days ago, have changed completely. So just as a reminder to everyone, the CDC and World Health Organization put out guidance that talk about personal hygiene and cleaning and those type of things. We'll include all of those links as well on our website. The CDC guidance remains the same as it has for the past several days, so that provides a good resource for you to point to. We did receive a question about the mayor's declared emergency and what that really means for the city. So when the mayor declares an emergency in the District of Columbia, it allows the city to respond to the emergency more rapid through different procurement laws. It opens up some of the budgetary restrictions that are in place on a normal basis and speeds some of the contracting, and the contracting restrictions that are in place allows the city to be a little more nimble and put contracts in place and get contractors in place to help them take care of their essential functions. The police, fire, the Department of Public Works, all of those core agencies now have a little more flexibility in how they can prepare and respond to this. Don, do you have anything else on mayor's declared emergencies that I didn't cover?
Just one. In some cities, and I'm not speaking specifically about DC, but in some cities it does allow the medical system to do what they need to do for surge. So that's something that it opens up some, again, some budgetary avenues that they might not have, eases contracting, and then lets them go to kind of to kind of review their standards of care plans. Not to enact them yet, we're so not there, but just to start looking at them.
Great. We received several questions about facility cleaning and that type of thing, and we haven't, no one has put forth so far very clear guidance on what that looks like. I wish we could give you a great answer, point to something that is very clear, but at this point, you have to really talk to your local health department, talk to others within your cleaning company, and see what that looks like. We did receive a question from one of the tenant organizations that asked about the training level for their cleaning company within their building. That's one thing that would be a great conversation to have with your property manager. Have that engaged conversation. Talk about what the cleaning process is. Talk about what they're using and what the training levels. That would have to be kind of answered at a building to building level. We also finally received a question from a property manager that talked about obligation to notify other tenants within a building of an exposure or a potential exposure or a positive test result or a presumed test result positive. That would be something that each individual property management company would need to talk to their counsel about and decide within their organization at what level they're comfortable doing that and how are they going to do that as a company. And ultimately, each individual company that'll be one of those decision-making processes as we get through this and move past through this incident. So for the second section of this kind of exercise, we're going to talk through kind of this situation escalating. So we're going to move to a local or national outbreak. So as we talked earlier, as we've seen in other countries, this does have the potential to and probability to spread to a more widespread issue. Dawn, can we talk for a second about some trigger points that may push a continuity plan into execution in a more widespread manner? What kind of trigger point should folks be looking for? We talked a little bit about that earlier, but just in a little more detail.
Sure. So some trigger points might be kind of what your locality is doing. So what the district decides to do. So if the district is closing down all of district buildings that are non-essential, that might trigger some actions on your part. School closures, it's a huge one. So if the schools are closed, that is absolutely going to increase your absenteeism and might kind of lead you to be more creative about some policies that you can put in place to keep people, as many people working as much as possible, if they can do so remotely or in different shift works and things like that. And then finally, kind of any OPM status changes, because we're in the center of the DC area. So any changes in OPM guidance or recommendations for federal government might be a trigger for your organization as well. Because your business districts in the downtown, closing of museums, closing of large buildings, of which which increases the circulation of people in this area, might be a trigger for you as well.
Those are great, Dawn, and I think as we said a little bit earlier, each organization should kind of be thinking through those and setting those for themselves. The next question I have is related to how to handle your essential functions over time and severity of the incident. We had a conference call talking about our essential functions with the district agency yesterday, and the director of that agency had a very good kind of phrasing where he talked about failing gracefully or falling gracefully. And I think that's really pertinent as we talk about this part. So, Dawn, you may have staff that are executing the essential functions in a remote environment or even not in a remote environment. You've done the cross-training of staff and now you're starting to see even more drop-off in that. What should folks how should folks handle that in their planning process, or what should they anticipate doing?
Well, I encourage you, if you're mission essential functions, there's essential and there's essential. If they're not organized in a priority manner, I would encourage you to do so at this point, because unfortunately, the longer kind of absenteeism and closures go on, there will be some failing gracefully. There'll be some dropping off of those mission essential functions that are no longer essential functions, either because the demand isn't there for that function, or because you just don't have the people, the equipment, the manpower, the supplies to be able to do them. So it's nice to have it organized kind of in order of importance, or in order of like, this is really, really important, but if we don't have this one supply, we can't get it done. So that one's going to end when that supply is out. So just being aware that mission essential list might shrink as we get further and further into an active pandemic in our area.
And Dawn, I think we've heard a lot of talk about telework and operating in a virtual environment. And we in our organization have made steps to give us that ability through IT systems and redundancies and things like that. How does conducting those mission essential functions change when you're shifting everything to operating in a virtual environment?
Yeah, we do this at work. I'm sure lots of folks on the call have some level of work at home policies that they use regularly. The things that happen when it becomes past a certain percentage of your employees doing it are the IT issues that we talked about. So sometimes you just don't have enough bandwidth to get all those people online, and the communication has to be critically important, so that making sure that everybody is talking to each other and that people aren't sitting at home working in a bubble. You can also, as Kara was talking about, those people that are working from home, that if they could come in kind of a day out of the week to do things, then it's staggering. You can stagger those folks, have them come in at different times so that you still have that social distancing between them, so that there might be a nice balance between working from home and then coming into the office when there really is something that you need to do from there.
That's great. And as Leona and Kara mentioned, there are some functions that aren't going to work well in that virtual environment, and you'll have to make plans and kind of prepare to figure out a way to conduct those. And those tips about shifting schedules and doing things like that are a great tip to kind of make sure you're shifting folks away from each other and conducting that social distancing. We talked a little bit about supply chain throughout this, but as we move further in this pandemic, what kind of additional supply chain challenges are you going to see, both from a business perspective, but also from a personal perspective?
Yeah, so anyone who's tried to get toilet paper in the Northern Virginia area already knows that we are having some supply chain issues. So obtaining products is going to become an issue, and this is going to be especially difficult for cleaning products, which are those products that you absolutely want to get in your door to make sure that your workplace is as clean and safe as possible. So checking with your vendors and making sure that, so you have a plan, right? Do they have a plan? How are they going to continue to make sure that their supply comes in? Are there other options? Are there backup vendors that you could be asking for? Is there a way to get this material elsewhere? That's the kind of thing you should be looking at. The travel, travel is, it's been obvious where not to travel right now, but in the near future, it might become, if it's not essential, you're not traveling. So are any kind of parts of your supply chain or any parts of your business based on travel? And if that's so, kind of what are the workarounds? Working in this virtual environment, it's hard at first, people get used to it, and it works. So kind of look at ways to minimize or even cut out travel and what that does to your business, and how you can still conduct business. And then anything else in your supply chain, we talked specifically about cleaning supplies, but anything that's associated with your mission essential function, how you're going to get it, if they have plans in place, how the transportation to get it to and from will still work, and then any alternative sources if they exist.
So it really seems, Don, like thinking of your continuity, you really need to think upstream and downstream of what impacts your organization, and whether it's products you need or the people you need or contractors you depend on, or shipping or traveling or doing all of these different things. You really need to think about your whole life cycle of that essential function. Is that a pretty good analogy, do you think, for analyzing your essential functions?
That's absolutely true. A business continuity assessment is exactly that. It's looking at the life cycle of what you do, from the human side of it to the supplies and equipment, to the enablers like transportation, to supply chain and everything along the way, to kind of map that out for yourself, how that looks from A to Z. And then making sure that, that you have redundancy. And then also kind of understanding, and this is a hard part of it, what might not actually be essential. And it might not be essential because the demand isn't there for what you supply for right now. If you have a tourism-based economy right now, the tourism might not be there, so some of your mission essentials functions can just drop off. But you just, for those things that you really do need to keep going, that's just making sure that you understand that real assessment of what it takes to make that happen.
That's great. That's great. Don, did we have anything that we didn't get to cover on continuity? Or any other tips you want to give people or anything?
I still do encourage you. So if anybody is sitting at home and can't do any functions, they can always look at their plans, right? It's a great time to do that business continuity assessment and work through what you need from A to B. Not a bad time to do continuity for cyber, because this cyber will still be happening during this. So kind of understanding how cyber might be different. Look at the different hazards that we face in the Washington, D.C. area, and start putting them against your continuity plan. We were all encouraged to do all hazards planning, and it's extremely valuable. But there is actually value in looking at specific threats. And making sure that we're planning against those as well. So if you are sitting at home and you have some time on your hands, I would recommend that everybody kind of go through their plans with this scenario and others in mind.
That's a great tip, Don. That's definitely something we have on our list of projects to work on if we shift to a virtual environment. I definitely want to work on updating our plans and doing some of that planning work. So with that said, I'd like to really thank our great experts, and Kara and Dawn and Leona and everybody kind of on our team, on my team that made this happen. Thank you all for sticking with us through this new format. I hope you found it useful, and we do, as I said, plan to publish those resources on our website. And then after a bit of time, we'll put up the video to this webinar, so that'll be up in the future as well. We hope you found this useful. Thank you very much for joining us. Start planning and keep going though with your business continuity plans. So thank you all.